take this job and shove it was asked me, said, David, how would you like to be a fireman? Because I guess a couple of the firemen got hurt, and I said, man, they can take that job and shove it. I don't look at it as prejudice. I don't look at it as racism. I just look at it as the reality of the situation.
David Allan Coe built his legend on rebellion, raw honesty, and a deep disdain for boundaries. But behind the mask of the outlaw poet lies a trail of contradictions that don't quite add up. His name still sparks fierce loyalty in some circles and just as much recoil in others. Was he a fearless truth-teller or just a man addicted to provocation? For decades, Coe has walked a tightrope between cult fame and cultural exile, leaning hard into shock value while insisting there's more to his story. But some details, once dismissed as side notes, now demand closer inspection. There's one particularly strange inconsistency he never addressed, even as it quietly rewrote how his music is remembered. The deeper you dig, the more the myth begins to splinter. What's left isn't just a controversial musician, it's a man whose legacy may rest not on what he created, but what he refused to confront. Death row and prison stories. David Allan Coe often claimed he spent time on death row for slaying an inmate who allegedly demanded sexual favors, one of the most shocking and persistent parts of his outlaw legend. The story helped shape his tough, untouchable persona and was repeated in interviews and liner notes. But despite how widely the tale has circulated, no legal record or prison documentation has ever verified it. No court case, conviction, or execution order exists to support the death row claim, raising serious doubts about its authenticity. Coe's prison history is verifiable to a degree. He spent significant time behind bars throughout his youth and early adulthood for crimes like auto theft and robbery. But the most dramatic aspects of his prison lore, including solitary confinement and facing execution, remain murky. Some suggest these claims were embellished or entirely invented as a way to market himself in the outlaw country scene, where street cred mattered just as much as musical skill. Even Screamin' Jay Hawkins, the bluesman Coe says mentored him in prison, has no confirmed records of incarceration at the same time or place as Coe. These inconsistencies prompt an uncomfortable question. How much of Coe's outlaw identity was constructed for shock value? In a genre that often glorifies rough pasts and redemption arcs, Coe's version of events pushed that narrative to an extreme. The tale of death row and inmate slaying placed him beyond typical outlaw figures like Johnny Cash, who only sang about prison life. Coe wasn't just an observer in his stories, he positioned himself as the ultimate insider, someone who had survived the worst. While it's not unusual for artists to create legends around themselves, Coe's case is particularly complex because of how his myth overlaps with real crimes and legal consequences. The lack of evidence hasn't stopped fans from repeating the story, and Coe himself has never fully walked it back. Whether exaggerated or outright fabricated, the unverified prison stories remain a key and controversial pillar of his public image. The question is whether they reflect truth, self-delusion, or a calculated attempt to sell the outlaw persona at any cost. If his prison stories raised eyebrows, what came next lit a fuse he never managed to put out. Racism and misogyny. David Allan Coe's Nothing Sacred, 1978, and Underground album, 1982, sparked some of the most intense criticism of his career. These independently released records were filled with lyrics that many listeners found deeply offensive, featuring overtly racist, misogynistic, and homophobic language. Sold primarily through biker magazines and mail order, they were intentionally kept outside mainstream distribution channels, but word of their content spread. The backlash from critics, journalists, and even some fans was swift and harsh, branding Coe as a provocateur whose lyrics crossed far beyond the lines of satire or outlaw rebellion. Some defenders of Coe argue the material was intended as crude biker humor or parody, not to be taken literally. But others, including media outlets and advocacy groups, saw the albums as more than just tasteless. They accused Coe of promoting hate under the guise of outlaw entertainment. Songs from these albums included racial slurs and graphic sexual scenarios, with little context or narrative justification. This wasn't the dark, poetic storytelling seen in his earlier work. It was explicit shock content that, to many, seemed designed to provoke outrage rather than convey any deeper message. Coe, for his part, has long denied that the songs were rooted in personal hatred. He later stated that the albums were meant for private party settings and not for general audiences. In a letter posted on his website, he claimed Shel Silverstein encouraged him to record the material, and he insisted the humor was misunderstood. Coe has also pointed to his multiracial band and past work with black musicians to defend himself against charges of racism. Still, those defenses have done little to undo the reputational damage, especially as the albums remain available for purchase, raising further questions about intent versus accountability. What complicates the matter is how these albums have come to define a portion of Coe's legacy. While he had undeniable songwriting talent, penning country hits like Would You Lay With Me, In a Field of Stone, and a Take This Job and Shove It, the X-rated albums are now frequently cited in discussions of his career. They've drawn attention not just for their content, but for what they say about the man who created them. Did Coe truly believe what he sang in those songs, or was he trying to test the limits of free speech and musical expression? Either way, the controversy they created continues to follow him decades later. The biker subculture and violent associations. David Allan Coe never made a secret of his close relationship with outlaw biker clubs, often describing them as both friends and part of his intended audience. In fact, he openly stated that Nothing Sacred and Underground album were created specifically for bikers to play at parties, not for the general public. This context does explain some of the crude, hyper-offensive material found on those albums, but it also connects Coe's music to a subculture known for its extreme, often violent, anti-establishment behavior. Coe's affiliation with these groups helped reinforce his image as someone who existed far outside the rules of polite society. But it also added a layer of menace that most country singers never approached. The biker world in the 1970s and 80s wasn't just about rebellion and freedom. It had darker sides involving criminal activity, racial tensions, and open displays of hyper-masculine aggression. Coe's alignment with this world, whether out of genuine personal connection or strategic branding, tied him to more than just a fan base. It associated him with a culture that embraced rule-breaking to the point of violence. This link made his X-rated material even more controversial, as critics saw it not just as offensive art, but as reflective of a worldview accepted within some parts of the biker community. Some observers have questioned whether Coe was using the biker aesthetic and connections for credibility or protection. Traveling and performing with biker crews may have offered security on the road, but it also raised questions about whether he condoned or was complicit in their behavior. Did Coe share their worldview, or was he simply leveraging their loyalty to keep his outlaw persona intact? This ambiguity made it harder for critics and fans alike to separate the man from the myth, and made the backlash against his controversial albums even more intense. While many artists have had tough audiences or embraced rebellious imagery, Coe's ties to outlaw biker clubs were unusually close and long-lasting. He didn't just cater to that demographic. He claimed to live among them, and while that association helped cement his outsider status, it also complicated his legacy. The biker connection wasn't just a marketing tactic, it was a real part of his identity, one that came with its own set of values, consequences, and unspoken codes that shaped how his music and public persona were perceived. Exploitation of shock value in music and image. David Allan Coe's use of shock value in both music and image was not accidental. It was a deliberate part of his identity as an artist and entertainer. Long before the mainstream embraced the idea of provocative branding, Coe was weaponizing outrage. He knew that pushing boundaries could earn attention, even if it meant alienating large segments of the public. Whether through controversial lyrics, extreme stage costumes like his Lone Ranger mask, or provocative interviews, Coe consistently positioned himself as someone willing to say and do what others wouldn't. This defiance made him a cult icon to some and a pariah to others. His most controversial material, especially the X-rated albums, was marketed with this mindset. Rather than being quietly released, these albums were advertised in biker magazines with an adults-only appeal, practically daring listeners to be offended. Coe embraced the backlash, often citing free speech as a shield, and leaning into the outlaw persona that didn't just break rules, it thrived on crossing the line. This wasn't simply storytelling, it was provocation. And for a segment of fans who felt alienated from mainstream culture, that provocation felt authentic and cathartic. But Coe's strategy also trapped him in a cycle where the shock had to escalate to stay effective. Once you've built a reputation on being offensive, toning things down risks losing your identity. This may explain why Coe kept revisiting the same themes of violence, intimacy, and rebellion, even when they stopped being commercially viable. It also may have contributed to his continued rejection by the music industry at large. While other outlaw artists evolved or softened with time, Coe seemed committed to digging deeper into controversy, no matter the cost to his broader reputation. The result is a legacy that's deeply fractured. On one hand, Coe remains respected as a raw, unfiltered songwriter capable of deeply emotional ballads. On the other, his insistence on shock for shock's sake overshadowed much of his work. Did Coe view outrage as artistic truth, or was it just a marketing tactic that got out of hand? That question lingers, especially as newer generations discover his music in a very different cultural climate, one where edgy content is more likely to draw condemnation than cult admiration. Financial ruin and the loss of song rights. David Allan Coe's 1984 bankruptcy marked a turning point that would haunt the rest of his career. In the midst of financial collapse, Coe was forced to sell the rights to all of his songs written before that year, including some of his biggest hits like Take This Job and Shove It and Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone. The price was reported to be just $225,000, a figure that pales in comparison to the long-term value of the royalties those songs could have generated. Coe later admitted he didn't even realize the deal had gone through until it was too late. The loss wasn't just symbolic, it had lasting, practical consequences. Without the publishing rights to his most valuable songs, Coe lost a key source of residual income. Unlike many of his peers who could rely on royalty checks from past successes, Coe had to keep performing to survive financially. Touring became his primary means of earning money, often in smaller venues or biker events that aligned with his brand but lacked the stability and scale of mainstream country success. The songs he had written, now out of his control, were making money for others, not for him. This financial instability created a vicious cycle. Without dependable income from publishing, Coe had to stay on the road constantly, which left little time or resources for reinvention or careful planning. It may also help explain why he leaned so hard into the controversial aspects of his persona, which guaranteed at least some loyal following even if they kept him outside the industry mainstream. It was survival over strategy. For someone who had built a reputation on doing things his own way, losing control over his own creations cut particularly deep. The bankruptcy fallout also casts a different light on Coe's later years. When artists lose ownership of their legacy, they often lose the power to shape it. While Coe continued to perform and release music, the work that defined his early success was legally and financially out of his hands. His catalog, once a symbol of creative defiance, became part of someone else's asset portfolio. For a figure who prided himself on independence, this was perhaps the most ironic and devastating blow of all. As his royalties vanished, what he chose to keep selling told an even louder story. Ongoing sale of offensive content, despite denials. Despite publicly distancing himself from his X-rated albums, Allan Coe has continued to sell Nothing Sacred and Underground album through his official website for years. This ongoing availability has raised questions about his sincerity in addressing the backlash those records generated. Coe has insisted in interviews and written statements that the albums were meant only for private biker audiences, not mainstream listeners. But keeping them in circulation, especially through his own channels, undermines those claims and suggests a willingness to profit from the very material he claims not to stand behind anymore. Critics and fans alike have pointed out the contradiction. If Coe truly regrets how those albums have shaped his reputation, why hasn't he removed them from sale? Some argue it's a matter of financial necessity. Given his history of bankruptcy and lost publishing rights, selling the albums may simply be a source of income he can't afford to abandon. Others believe Coe's continued promotion of the material is a quiet affirmation that he still stands by the content, regardless of what he's said publicly. Either way, the inconsistency keeps the controversy alive and complicates efforts to reframe or rehabilitate his image. This tension has played out in media coverage and fan discourse for decades. Journalists have confronted Coe about the racist and misogynistic content, and while he's repeatedly denied being a bigot, his unwillingness to fully disavow the albums has left room for doubt. Some see his defenses as rationalizations, pointing to his multiracial band or biker audience as shields, rather than genuine efforts to address the damage caused. Meanwhile, hate groups have reportedly embraced parts of his music, which only further fuels scrutiny over whether he's been irresponsible in curating his artistic legacy. The continued sale of the X-rated albums illustrates a deeper issue in Coe's career: the unwillingness to fully let go of the very content that cast a shadow over his legitimate artistic achievements. While many artists have created controversial work, few have been so closely tied to it for so long, especially after publicly claiming to move on. The fact that Coe's most offensive material remains just a few clicks away on his own website raises important questions about accountability, artistic integrity, and the true cost of never drawing a clear line between provocation and principle. Relationship with white supremacist allegations. Allan Coe has long faced accusations of aligning, intentionally or not, with racist ideologies, in part due to recurring imagery in his work and associations within his fan base. The most prominent example is his frequent use of the Confederate flag, a symbol that, for many, carries deeply racist and white supremacist connotations. While Coe has defended its use as a marker of Southern pride or rebellion, critics have pointed out that flying the flag, especially in combination with his controversial lyrics, makes it difficult to separate artistic intent from political implication. It's an aesthetic that has invited scrutiny from civil rights groups and cultural commentators alike. Compounding this perception are the lyrics from Coe's underground albums, which include racial slurs and themes widely considered offensive and inflammatory. While Coe has denied any racist intent and emphasized that the material was meant as satire or private humor among bikers, those defenses haven't quelled public concern. Some hate groups have reportedly adopted parts of Coe's music, particularly songs from the Underground album, citing them as examples of unfiltered expression. Even if Coe never sought that audience, the fact that his work resonates in those circles has continued to cloud his reputation. In response to accusations of racism, Coe has pointed to his band's diversity, specifically his African-American drummer, Kerry Brown, the son of bluesman Clarence "Gatemouth" Brown, as evidence that he doesn't support white supremacist views. He has also referenced early performances with an all-black R&B band and claimed admiration for black musical influences. However, critics argue that these facts, while notable, don't fully address the impact of the lyrics themselves or the imagery he's chosen to embrace. At best, they complicate the narrative. At worst, they appear as deflections from deeper concerns. What adds another layer of complexity is the way Coe handled or failed to handle the backlash. He rarely engaged in meaningful dialogue about these criticisms, often brushing them off or challenging critics without offering clarification. Unlike artists who have used public platforms to reflect, apologize, or recontextualize their earlier work, Coe often took a defensive stance, treating critique as an attack rather than an opportunity to clarify intent. This unwillingness to participate in his own cultural reckoning allowed speculation and resentment to fester. His merchandising choices also played a role in keeping the controversy alive. Coe didn't just display Confederate imagery on stage. He sold it on t-shirts and album covers, sometimes pairing it with inflammatory slogans or imagery that appeared tone-deaf at best, hostile at worst. Whether it was a deliberate form of provocation or a marketing decision aimed at a specific audience, the result was the same: further alienation from mainstream circles and growing discomfort even among longtime fans. What's especially damaging is that Coe's musical talent is often sidelined by these issues. Discussions about his songwriting, once a major talking point, have become increasingly rare, drowned out by the moral debates his aesthetic choices incite. Even his defenders, when pressed, often concede that his handling of racial themes has been, at minimum, deeply irresponsible. The broader question remains whether Coe failed to understand the weight of the imagery and language he used, or simply chose not to care. In a genre already grappling with issues of race and inclusion, Coe's body of work continues to stir debate over what constitutes satire, provocation, or endorsement. Even decades after the most controversial material was released, its existence and Coe's uneven response to criticism has led to persistent associations with white supremacist culture. Whether this was the result of carelessness, marketing, or deeper beliefs is a question that still divides fans, critics, and the country music community. Self-mythologizing and dubious biographical claims. David Allan Coe's public persona has long been shaped by a blend of fact, exaggeration, and outright myth-making. Throughout his career, he crafted a larger-than-life identity rooted in stories of prison time, outlaw rebellion, and unfiltered authenticity. Some of these stories, like the unverified claim that he spent time on death row for slaying a fellow inmate, were repeated so often they became part of his legend, even without evidence to support them. Whether these tales were born from memory, performance, or marketing strategy remains unclear, but they played a critical role in defining Coe's image. This tendency towards self-mythologizing wasn't limited to his prison stories. Coe also claimed he once lived in a cave after the IRS seized his property, that he was mentored in prison by Screamin' Jay Hawkins, and that he had performed with Jimi Hendrix in an all-black R&B band, claims that either lack evidence or directly contradict known timelines. These types of anecdotes, while compelling, raise questions about Coe's relationship to the truth. Did he believe these accounts himself, or was he deliberately blurring reality to maintain a compelling outlaw narrative? What makes Coe's self-created mythology so impactful is how effectively it blurred the line between character and creator. While other artists would break the fourth wall, offering glimpses of the real person behind the persona, Coe never dropped the act. He seemed to live inside the myth, refusing to acknowledge what was real and what was theater. Interviews often added to the confusion. He'd mix humor with apparent sincerity, making it difficult for even close observers to distinguish fact from fiction. This made him a fascinating figure, but also a frustrating one for anyone trying to assess his true story. His biographies and press materials echoed these embellishments, creating a kind of echo chamber where legends grew bigger with every retelling. Coe didn't just tolerate this mythology, he curated it. He knew that in the world of outlaw country, truth was often less important than narrative, and he leaned into the performance with the flair of a showman who understood the value of mystique. But that mystique came at a cost. As the cultural climate shifted and audiences began demanding more transparency and accountability, Coe's stubborn commitment to the myth began to look less like branding and more like evasion. The refusal to correct the record even as inaccuracies were exposed, began to erode trust. Listeners were no longer just questioning his lyrics, they were questioning his integrity. And still, Coe held fast to the outlaw script, clinging to tales that no longer served him. In doing so, he not only cast doubt on his past, but muddied the waters of his actual accomplishments. For every confirmed achievement, a charting song, a major tour, a hit recorded by another artist, there lingered a question mark from his self-spun folklore. His real legacy became trapped under layers of invented legend. The result is a legacy riddled with contradictions. Coe, the musical craftsman, and Coe, the unreliable narrator. He helped shape a genre that celebrated realness, yet often presented a version of himself that felt anything but. Fans are left to sift through the wreckage of myth, trying to figure out where the man ends and the performance begins. In the end, David Allan Coe didn't just tell stories, he became one. And like all the best stories, this one leaves more questions than answers. Underground fame versus mainstream exile. David Allan Coe's refusal to conform to industry norms ultimately cemented his place in underground music, but permanently barred him from the mainstream acceptance his talents may have otherwise earned. While peers like Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson eventually found a balance between outlaw identity and commercial success, Coe doubled down on controversy. His X-rated albums, incendiary lyrics, and provocative persona alienated radio stations, major labels, and the more polished corners of country music. For Coe, there seemed to be no middle ground. He either did things entirely his way or not at all. This uncompromising stance did cultivate a fiercely loyal following in fringe subcultures, bikers, blue-collar workers, and others drawn to his raw, unfiltered narratives. But that same approach also made him a liability in an industry increasingly concerned with marketability and optics. Producers distanced themselves, labels stopped calling, and some venues quietly removed his name from bookings to avoid controversy. His absence from the Grand Ole Opry or the Country Music Hall of Fame isn't a mystery. It's the result of years of being considered too unpredictable, too volatile, or simply too toxic to celebrate. Coe's alienation wasn't just commercial, it became cultural. He was rarely invited to collaborate, and even when other artists admired his songwriting, they did so quietly. There were no major retrospectives, no televised tributes, no inclusion in greatest of lists, despite his contributions to the genre. The outlaw movement that once welcomed him began to move on without him. He became something of a cautionary tale. What happens when rebellion becomes a brand, and that brand becomes too dangerous to touch? Even his fan base fractured over time. Some continued to champion him as a martyr of political incorrectness, while others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the baggage attached to his name. Unlike many country artists whose legacies are actively managed and polished through documentaries, reissues, and museum exhibits, Coe's legacy remained frozen in time. Fragmented, controversial, and largely shaped by others. His reputation was further strained by an unwillingness to evolve. As the country music landscape shifted, embracing crossover acts, genre hybrids, and digital platforms, Coe's presence remained stuck in an earlier era, rarely adapting to changing formats or audience expectations. He made few attempts to modernize his sound or image, even as his peers found new life through reinvention. What might have been a career renaissance was instead an extended holding pattern, dependent on nostalgia and controversy rather than fresh artistic growth. And while Coe continued to tour into his later years, often to enthusiastic niche crowds, the venues grew smaller, the exposure more limited. Major festivals and country radio left him behind. Younger artists who once might have cited him as an influence began to avoid the association altogether. The mainstream didn't simply reject Coe, it erased him, not by force, but through silence, not by censorship, but by choosing never to look back. In the end, David Allan Coe didn't just live outside the mainstream, he burned the bridge back to it. And in doing so, he traded recognition for notoriety. His name still echoes in country circles, but more often in whispers than applause. His defiance kept him underground, but what it cost him can't be measured in chart positions alone. Artistic brilliance tainted by extremism. David Allan Coe's legacy is one of country music's most conflicted. He wrote songs that cut deep, introspective, poetic, and emotionally raw. Tracks like The Ride and Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone earned praise from legends and peers alike, showcasing a depth that few questioned. But those songs now compete with a different kind of legacy, one built on provocation, vulgarity, and lines crossed so aggressively that many in the industry refuse to speak his name at all. What separates Coe from other controversial artists is not just the content, but the persistence. While some musicians distanced themselves from youthful mistakes or sought understanding through later work, Coe doubled down. He never made a clear effort to reckon with the most damaging elements of his catalog. There were no public apologies, no interviews offering reflection, just silence, deflection, or worse, defiance. In the absence of context, his harshest material became the loudest part of his story. The result is that younger listeners discovering his music often encounter the worst first. On YouTube uploads, fan forums, or social media debates, many don't hear the songwriting brilliance until they've already formed an opinion. That's a rare reversal in country music, where legacy artists are typically introduced through their most timeless work. For Coe, it's the opposite. The shocking parts of his career cast a shadow long before anyone hears a melody or a lyric worth saving. Cultural institutions have largely written him out. While his songs have been covered by major artists and his influence is felt in the outlaw lineage, Coe's name remains radioactive in official circles. He's absent from tributes, excluded from documentaries, and often omitted from country music timelines entirely. Some of this erasure may be self-inflicted. By refusing to change, he made himself easy to forget. But the bigger issue is trust. Industry gatekeepers, historians, and fans can't separate the man from the damage. And yet, there's still a strange pull in Coe's story. It's a test case in legacy. What survived when talent collides with controversy, and controversy wins? Coe remains a cult figure, but the price of that cult status was enormous. His genius wasn't erased. It was buried, not by critics or cancel culture, but by choices he made and never looked back on. In the end, the tragedy isn't just that his reputation was tainted, it's that he made no real effort to rescue it. If this pulled back the curtain in ways you weren't expecting, you're just scratching the surface. Hit the like button if you want more deep dives, and drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've got a different take. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And before you go, click the next video on screen. What's in that one might just change how you see another outlaw legend.